quite lucky today because we've got Doug Moulton, who's our Director of Planning, and just wanted to bring Doug into this conversation. So Doug, how is property flood resilience and things like flood warning evacuation plans dealt with in planning?
I think just from a planning perspective, and I think a more general comment to start with is just obviously, you know, local residents are always really concerned about flood risk because it affects them. It's very visual in the news, and obviously there's lots of areas at risk of flood risk in historical, and as you said, through climate change and changing behaviour of water patterns, particularly pluvial, you know, there's knock-on effects through new development. So it's always whenever I do any kind of planning applications, you know, people always speak to me about flood risk and its impacts and what does this development mean. Like, we've got an existing flood risk problem, how are you going to help address it through it? And I think this is fed through with, you know, we're having to do more detailed flood risk assessments and drainage plans to address lead local flood authority concerns. And then it's just that cascading down really, isn't it, Scott, down to that local layer and about how flood resilience, simple measures can be brought in to improve the situation from the current situation, which is what it's all about really, isn't it?
Yeah, our overall aim is always to try and direct development outside of flood risk zones, isn't it? That's like, when we start with a client, we're trying to sequentially develop a site, move that development into an area that's going to be at the lowest risk possible. And if we can do that, it means that we might not have to do any of this property flood resilience measures. However, there are instances, obviously, and it's something that the government and potentially another future Labour government, if they do get in, that will be directing as much development as possible to brownfield areas of the UK, and they will probably be at risk of flooding in some respect. And as long as they obviously fit with the NPPF framework on vulnerability and they're acceptable in those terms, it may be that they'll condition planning, say for instance on a change of use for a building that was formerly like an office and could become residential. They might say, well, you need to address PFR measures for that building because it sits in a flood zone. And that's going to be increasing more and more, I think.
I think it's a really interesting point that, you know, planning policy directs a regeneration of brownfield sites first policy, yet historically, because of where they are, they're often at risk of flooding. So, you know, we have this debate on quite a few sites, haven't we, Matt, over the years about, you know, where does regeneration and flood risk sit against, you know, wider benefits? And with how permitted development rights have been used by the recent Conservative government in this idea of trying to quickly generate and deliver new housing, then, you know, office conversion is one of those areas where, you know, flood evacuation management plans are absolutely key because obviously you can make your ground floor flood resilient, not have habitable rooms in there, and then obviously everyone from the first floor up has to have the benefit of that management plan, and that all planning to make a project acceptable in planning terms, you might have to use suitably worded planning conditions, and for this situation you would condition that flood resilience to make sure that it is safe for the future use of that building for the proposed use.
And you've both been involved in a number of aspects when we're looking at where to site development, the NPPF, which is the National Planning Policy Framework. That brings something in called the sequential test. I know you've both looked at that, which is where it's the idea of the sequential test to direct development to the lowest risk possible. But you've looked at a number of schemes. We looked at Healings Mill in Tewkesbury, and we also looked at a number of schemes down in Bath.
Yeah.
Do you think that part of planning policy builds into some of these flood risk and flood protection criteria?
I think for me, I think that the sequential and then the exceptions test is that. And it's very much up to the local planning authority who receives that application as to the level of importance they put on the regeneration of the site. And I know when we've done like purpose-built student accommodation or hotels, it's about almost saying that, you know, there's so much demand for these types of development and they're better located on a regeneration site in a central city location because obviously people can walk to the shops and the facilities. But obviously from a flood risk policy perspective, you are, you know, in breach of that policy. So planning's always a balance. So for me, it's getting those policy objectives balanced and making sure that there's sufficient flood resilience, which is protected through the conditions and then, you know, building regulations to make sure that the future site is safe.
Yeah, and my experience is slightly different on that kind of scheme. So I've done a lot of work in the leisure industry for holiday park operators, and once they've established a site, and some of these sites have been established for probably more than 50 years, and they're coastal environments, so odds are they're going to be in a flood zone, and these businesses, to continue to operate, need to move forwards and expand their operations. So there is a way of you getting those permissions if they are a small enough extension to a site, like we did at Alberta. If you can argue that, and you have a robust flood plan in for that site, then you can demonstrate that you can mitigate appropriately within the planning guidance, and we've demonstrated that quite clearly and very strongly at planning appeal.
I was going to say, you do talk about Alberta, but that was a site that you had to take to plan and appeal to justify that your method was correct.
Yes, even though we'd taken loads of guidance from the local authority about what they wanted in that assessment, ultimately they tried to refuse it on that basis, and we were able to very squarely put it back in their court about why we'd done what we did.
And if I remember correctly, Doug, we also awarded costs for that scheme.
That's it. But I think it's just that you local planning authorities, they have to provide that balance, and obviously local residents are always concerned about flood risk. So, like I say, it's the importance of showing your economic and environmental benefits alongside that flood resilience for the overall application project package to be deemed acceptable, for it not to have to go to appeal.
So if we looked at the two topics we've been talking about property flood protection, and we've also been talking about how flood risk works into the planning. What would you say, Scott, are your sort of top two tips to successfully secure your planning permission or successfully use property level protection?
In terms of planning permission, I'll just park that for a minute. I think in terms of the average person that has got a property and it's at flood risk, or they think it might be at flood risk, the first thing I would say is if you're buying a property or your business buying a new building and you get some searches paid for during the acquisition process, pay attention to them. I've come across people where I've gone in to go and fit or scope up the fitment of PFR measures on the building, and they openly admit to me that we did have searches and it did say high risk on there for flooding, but I asked around and nobody said they'd been flooded, so it was fine. And it just seemed crackers to me. You pay money for data and some valuable input from somebody who's an expert, and you ignore it. So first and foremost, if you can avoid buying a property that's in flood risk, do so. If you are already in that property, whether you're a business or a private homeowner, have your own flood plan, a personal flood plan, and that's something that's pushed forward by the Environment Agency on their guidance. Okay, what does that mean? Well, first of all, you need to know how to access information about whether there's flooding coming your way. You might not be plugged into the TV all the time. You might not listen to the radio. So some way of you receiving that information is a really good thing to have. Being personally prepared and personally resilient for that flooding is a massive gain. I've written it in documents that we've put out on LinkedIn lately in articles. Don't go waiting for the council or Environment Agency to ride in on a white horse and save you. You've got to take action yourself and make sure that you're prepared. And then, if you think, yes, I'm definitely at a flood risk, go and get a quote on getting PFR measures, or approach somebody like us, a consultancy that can go and do the inspection for you. We'll come around your house, we'll show you where all these vulnerabilities are, we'll provide you a package that you can then go and approach somebody with. You don't have to know anything about what you're trying to get at that point. The document gives you everything you need, and then they can come in and give you a reasonable quote to get those measures fitted, and then know obviously how to use them afterwards.
That's good. Do you want to take the planning point, Doug? Where do you see flooding sitting in the current planning?
I think flood risk is a key issue. And as Scott says, strategic planning should always try and lead development to the areas at lowest risk of flooding, because you have flood risk assessments, strategic flood risk assessments done across a whole local planning authority area, and their development plans, which is their framework development over the next 20 years, should be shaped by those constraints. So I think that's the starting point. But I think, equally for me personally, I think it's got to be accepted that sites, regeneration sites, underutilised, previously developed land, for me, as long as you can confirm that you can make it safe for flood risk resilience for the lifetime of it, then I think that use should be encouraged. but obviously there is policy requirements what have to be passed, which can be very difficult within the planning system.
Thank you very much for that, guys. So just in summary of today, I think it's really important that the property flood protection measures that Scott's been talking about, it's key that they're stored well, they're fully maintained, and they've been installed properly by somebody who's got the relevant accreditations from the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. It's also interesting talking about, if you are in a flood situation, looking at that flood warning plan, whether that's a personal one or one for business, which can get you prepared and ready for the action that can occur. And then I think the final comment, Doug, that you brought to us around the planning process and making sure that strategic planning is feeding through, and that there are always going to be regeneration sites that require flood risk and require measures to bring them forward because of the unique location that they're in. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening to us today. If you want to follow us at enzygo.com or on Instagram or LinkedIn, you can get more updates and find out what we're doing. Thank you.